Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is the writer Caleb Johnson of Arley, Alabama. Johnson studied writing here at the university with Rick Bragg, and then went on to the University of Wyoming to study writing with University of Alabama graduate Bragg Watson. He is the author of an astonishing first novel, Borne. I spoke with Caleb Johnson in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Caleb, it's nice to see you again.
Great to see you, Don.
We had a chance. We've had two opportunities to talk. Once in Montgomery and then once here about a month ago. And I've been looking forward to this more formal talk. You come from a place, I even asked some of the people on the crew if they'd ever heard of Arley, Alabama, and no one has.
It's not uncommon to not have heard
Where
of
is
it.
your home place and what's it near and how would we get there?
You would hit Highway 69 out of town here and go about an hour, 45 minutes north, and you would eventually arrive in the general area. The most notable attraction is Lewis Smith Lake, which is a man-made lake that was dammed up in the 1960s, and now it's a lot of people have second homes there. They visit during the summer. They water ski and swim and fish, and so that's if someone's heard of Smith Lake.
And they have.
They have, but they haven't heard of Arley, which is a community on the lake. Yeah.
One of your magazine pieces is about the privatization of the world. There once was a time when you could go to the shore of that lake, not only go in swimming when you felt like it, but actually camp for a week.
No more, or it's more difficult. Yeah, and it's sort of I think like every family has a sort of a tragic story they love to recount, over and over to themselves, and mine had to do with opportunities that my granddaddy had to buy acreage on the lake when it was first dammed up, and land was much cheaper. No one kind of foresaw this real estate boom in the 80s that has continued now into this century, and he didn't do it for, depending on who you ask, my grandmother or my mother, or whoever, for a number of reasons. But that's sort of the great tragic story of our family, that we could have had this cheap lake property and we never did. But it didn't matter growing up because, like I wrote about, there were places you could go that maybe a timber company owned it, or maybe just somebody owned it but hadn't developed the lake shore, and you could just kind of walk down or take old logging roads down to the lake, and nobody minded if you camped as long as you cleaned up.
And you even pitched a camp for a week.
Yeah, for a week at a time. That was sort of like in the summer, our
nice.
family that lived outside the county would come, and we would all camp for a week and spend time together.
Well, after an idyllic childhood,
in some ways,
in North Alabama, graduate from high school, and you come here to study journalism. Now, this interview is about you and your work, but I have to stop for a minute. The first time I heard this little bit of information, I was stunned. You studied writing with Rick Bragg here, and then went on and studied writing with Bragg Watson in Wyoming. Now, I think those two guys are two of the finest prose writer, fiction writer, two of the best alive. And here you are, having passed through both of them. In my mind, I think I know what you learned from Rick Bragg and what you learned from Bragg Watson, but I'm often wrong about reading minds. So you tell me.
Yeah, it was amazing to study with both of those guys, and I was an admirer of their work beforehand, and so I felt a little nervous and also very fortunate to study with them. But with Rick, two things I really got from him. One being, hey, you can write about rural people and rural lives, and they matter, and these stories need to be told. And he's staked his career on that. It didn't really occur to me until I was exposed to his work and other folks like Larry Brown is another writer who I kind of learned this from. But in Rick's class, his sentences, they sing. Everyone does.
I know.
And I really learned to get an ear for for how to make your writing sing and the importance of that from him. It had to be, there had to be a narrative, but it had to be told beautifully. And of course, that's something I was around growing up with my family and sort of oral storytelling tradition. But with Rick, I started to see how you could translate that to the page. And that was really meaningful to me. And then with Brad, maybe the greatest thing I learned from him was patience with the work and patience with the process, because he is such a craftsman when it comes to his stories and his novels. And it's not even that I learned that you shouldn't get frustrated, or you shouldn't struggle, because God knows that's part of it, but it's that that's part of it, right? And eventually, if you struggle through this process, you'll come to a point where your narratives have this resonance and depth that others just don't.
He won't let it go.
He won't.
Until he thinks it's right.
Yeah.
And all of us who are his readers and fans, I mean, I've done everything but light a fire under, but no, it's not ready yet. It's not ready yet. And then when it is ready, like Miss Jane, it is as ready as it can be.
And that's the philosophy I took with my novel too, and I took it from Brad. It's got to be ready. It's got to be as done as I can possibly get it before it goes out to anybody.
Those are living teachers. I mean, they're people who affected your life, in the flesh, so to speak. You've written an article about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you've spoken from time to time about Faulkner, and of course, in different once this is in the reader's head, of course, then you see it. You think, well, of course, this looks like Absalom, and this looks like 100 Years of Solitude, and another little bit looks like oral history from Lee Smith, the boy with the. Never mind the living influences, but you're a debut novelist, and people always ask new novelists, what did you read that mattered? Those two, and what?
Like I mentioned a moment ago, Larry Brown was big for me. Larry, at the time I read him, was still alive, and it was one of the first times when I encountered the work of a living writer writing about the rural South, and it was art, it was literature, it was beautiful, and it was complex, and it blew my mind that was going on. So later on, another Mississippi writer, Lewis Norden, his work was really important. The Sharpshooter Blues was kind of a touchstone for me writing Treeborn in a way too. I love Carson McCullers' Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and just sort of the dark humor of that is something I aspire to in my fiction as well. And Marquez, of course, Faulkner, of course, and their emphasis on family stories, on myth, on writing about cultures and places that are vanishing or have vanished. Was something I wanted to be in conversation
You and
with.
Rick and Larry Brown and so many others you're all I.B. Singer without even knowing it. You're recording the last days of not the shtetl in this case, but the last days of rural southern places that will inevitably disappear, I think. Your novel is very ambitious, as first novels often are. I often wonder why first novelists don't tell smaller stories.
I've got a theory on it.
Well, your novel takes several generations. Total number of years is not huge. It's 20 to 90 or more or less. What is the advantage for you of a novel that goes from grandparent to parent to children and so on? Why'd you do that?
Well, I think because I wanted to get it all in. I wanted to get everything in, and I think that's kind of my theory with first-time novelists, is that we feel this maybe self-created pressure to get everything from our lives, everything leading up to this moment, which is a monumental thing to write your first book. To get all in we possibly can. And so I had this family history, and I had this place, and I had these myths that I'd spent my whole life swimming in, and then my later years considering and reconsidering, and I wanted to do that. And so that's part one, but part two is, as I began writing Treeborn and discovering these characters and these places, I couldn't tell them no. I would meet someone else in the town, and I would say, hey, I've got to explore their story. I've got to give them a point of view. I've got to follow them, even if we digress a little bit. and I just couldn't say no to them, and I couldn't leave them once I met them until I'd spent a little bit of time with them at least.
Well, there we are in your home place. And North Alabama is not as fraught racially as the Black Belt. But in your novel, most of the people are white, but not Lee Malone. Mm-hmm. Lee Malone, do you think of Lee Malone as central, or is that something I've imposed on it?
Yeah, sure. I think he's a central character. You know, he's sort of the most important character that's not named Treeborn.
Yes.
But I think of him as part of the Treeborn family because of how close he is, both in a romantic way and not, with this family throughout the years, and with the land too that they're involved with. So yeah, he's super central to the novel. And as far as the racial makeup of the novel of Treeborn, you know, I didn't want to write, and I wasn't attempting to write a story of racial reconciliation, you know. And I also didn't want to write a novel that was, this is about a racially motivated crime, right? Even though both of those things are sort of happening in the story, I didn't want that to be the main arc, and I wanted to show what to me felt just like a more truthful version of race in the South and in the small town rural South where I come from, at least, which is that it's not quite as simple or clean cut as some of these other narratives we've seen. And, you know, there's not necessarily a neat bow we can put on it. No. You know, we've made some progress, and Lee Malone makes some progress by the end of the novel, or by the end of his narrative. He owns some land. You know, he runs a peach orchard that's central to the town's economy, but he also can't be with the woman he loves because
not openly.
Not openly, yeah,
right.
Not openly.
Right.
And so that felt a little more human to me, rather than some triumphant tale of racial reconciliation.
Oh, I don't think there are any triumphs.
No, I don't think so either.
To be had. But he interacts with all the white characters, and for a little while it looks like he's going to be in trouble. But of course, he is innocent, and we have to. we are in this case gratified that he is not lynched or hanged or sent away to prison or whatever.
And he is interacting with all the white characters, but I think it's important to note too that he's closest with the Treeborns, and they are, even though they're a white family, they're outsiders in this place. You know, they live outside town. They have this strange history. You know, they have Hugh's art and Maybell's quirks, and so they are within this predominantly white town, outsiders in a way too. So it makes more sense that they would be friends with Lee Malone and interact with him differently than others.
Two things that in that family that you just mentioned that are both subjects. If people were writing term papers about Treeborn, one of them could be Hollywood and Treeborn, and Treeborn, the novel Treeborn, and the other might be folk art and the novel Treeborn. Hugh is an outsider artist. Is that the term you like to use, or what? Folk artist, outsider, untrained, what?
Yeah, I don't, maybe self-taught. You know, I've used outsider in the past, but I'm also sort of sensitive to the connotations of what that might mean. You know, but yeah, he is, and I'm a big fan of that type of art. You know, in a more formal setting and not, you know, and what I mean by that is if you drive around these back roads in western Alabama, you can see plenty of self-taught artists' work on display, nailed to trees in front yards, on mailboxes, and I've always admired that. But also the you know, some of these artists are in museums now, and Howard Finster and Thornton Dial, who lived up in Bessemer, was actually a big inspiration for Hugh's character and the type of work that he creates.
Well, Kentuck is coming up here in Tuscaloosa in a few weeks, and there'll be lots of it there as well. He makes, he doesn't paint exactly, he doesn't sculpt exactly, he makes assemblies. I tried very hard, I really did. I read your description of these and I tried to visualize them. You can visualize them, can't you?
Sure, absolutely.
Because you made them.
Yeah, I did.
And they're wire and bone and paint and old pieces of metal and
Yeah, I think of it sort of like a three-dimensional canvas or a three-dimensional work on canvas. Most of the assemblies, some are a little more freestanding sculpture in my head, depending on the work. But yeah, if you think about a really textured canvas or a frame that then is built kind of from the frame up in that way, that's how I envision Hughes' assemblies.
Well, one of them is a giant frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sort of hangs over
on
top.
a loom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he is, I think, in this novel, the character who stands for art.
Yeah.
He can't help it. He's going to make them. You can't stop him.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the perfidious Yankee. There's often a perfidious Yankee, the man who comes by and takes them off and sells them and gets credit for them.
Mm-hmm. You know, Hugh, that compulsion to make art is something that I think any of us who tell stories are maybe familiar with. And when I have students ask me, or if I'm doing an event and someone in the audience says something like, how do you know you want to be a writer? Or like, well, I think I want to be a writer. And my simple answer is, if you're entirely compelled to do it, then you'll do it and you'll know it. And you can't live your life any other way. And that's sort of how it is for Hugh Treborn too.
I think it's very important, especially with writing, to discourage people.
You think so?
Yes, I do. There are entirely too many writers.
Yeah.
There are way too many bad writers. There are millions of mediocre writers, and they must be stopped. only the writers who are absolutely driven to do it should be allowed to continue. The rest should be stopped.
Yeah.
And turned into some useful form of enterprise. Art with Hugh Treborn is compulsion, and he does it, and he even when it's stolen from him or nobody notices, he continues to do it. With Tammy Treborn, it is Tammy, right? Who's obsessed with Hollywood. She wants to go to Hollywood. She wants to be an actor. She wants to open up a movie theater. I mean, I saw that as first cousin to what Treborn was doing. Is that along the lines that you were thinking?
What I was thinking with Tammy is, if you've grown up in a small town or a very rural place like I grew up, some of us want nothing but to leave and get out.
Yeah.
We want to experience something new. You know, we want to experience something out of the mundane and every day of our lives, and so many people don't get to. And I love where I'm from, and my family's still there, and it's extremely meaningful to who I am as a human and a writer.
Yeah.
But I always wanted to go too. I wanted to travel. I wanted to live new places. I wanted to meet new people and experience different ways of living. And so Tammy, in some way, is a little bit of that side of my personality and past. And I think it is a pretty common story. You know, if you talk to people from small places, that desire to flee, and then the tension for me is, well, are you able to? And if you are able to, then what happens if you do? Because there's going to be consequences for it one way or another.
Yeah. I taught for a long time evenings in Gadsden, and one of the things I learned slowly over time in Gadsden is that people move a trailer in 100 yards from where they grew up, and in the morning the women get on the phone and talk about what they're going to feed their husbands.
Yep.
I thought, oh no, get up, fly.
It's very insular, you know, and I feel really torn in a lot of ways because I have left, you know, and I try to maintain deep ties to my place and my people, but I've gone, you know, and it's been a decade now since I've gone, and I've changed, and I'm still sort of figuring out what that means for me.
Well, you lived here. I know you lived in Wyoming. I know you live in Boone. And there was somewhere else. Did you live in New York for a while?
Not New York, in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, that's right.
And Pittsburgh, so.
So you've traveled around. You know what there is to see.
I have. I've made a big loop. Yeah.
There's even a scene in your book, this little scene, the open audition for it is Gone with the Wind, right?
Well, it's something like Gone with the Wind.
But you know, Gone with the Wind had open auditions all over America. And when I was a little boy, I knew people who had tried out in New York.
Oh, wow.
For Gone with the Wind.
Wow. And
you have an open audition in Birmingham. And of course, it's a casting couch as well. I mean, it's crooked and it's corrupt.
And that's Maybelle, the matriarch of the Treborn family, goes to this audition, and it doesn't go as planned. And it's a part of her life that, although she shared many, it's not a story she shared a lot with her family. And so then the resonance is Tammy her daughter wasn't necessarily aware of this time in her mother's life,
No,
but
no.
she experiences a similar dream, right? Maybelle went to Birmingham for an audition, but Tammy wants to go to Hollywood to star in movies and never gets her chance.
The Gulf of Mexico is, I think, what Tahiti is in some other people's imagination, kind of like James Michener, Tales of the South Pacific, sailboats and natives and warm water and coconuts. Apparently in Alberta, Alabama, the Gulf of Mexico operates like Tahiti in the popular imagination. Well, it's a place to go. It's magic.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you grew up in the woods of North Alabama, the first time you see that sugar white sand on the beaches in the Gulf of Mexico, you'll never forget it. It's the most exotic landscape I'd ever seen for a large part of my life, And to me too, there's something mysterious about any large body of water, and which I explore a lot in this novel too. So whether I'm standing on the edge of Smith Lake or the Gulf of Mexico, I'm looking out across that water and I'm thinking about all the things that are underneath it, all the people who have traveled across it or on it, and it fascinates me. I can't help but I've sort of always had this dream since I was a kid of anytime I see a big body of water, I just wish so badly I could see it completely drained, because I want to see what the landscape looks like underneath. Whether there's anything man-made under there or not, I want to see what the landscape was like before this much water was there. And it's just sort of an obsession and fantasy of mine.
It's a biblical flood, except in your novel, there's the building of the dam, which is going to flood the valley. And at the end of the novel, there's the taking down of the dam, which is going to reveal what was underwater and then ruin where the dam water goes to. This is you and I spoke about this once a while back. This is a motif in Southern literature. There are half a dozen novels in which somehow or other the building of the hydroelectric project, the dam, it causes things to be hidden. It causes things to be revealed. I mean, how do you think it works for you?
I think so much of it is it's the presence of the TVA and that history and myth looming large in our imagination and in our landscape. If you grow up here, you grow up seeing lakes and dams and rivers in places they didn't used to be and disappeared too. And it's just it can't help but loom that large, because the TVA and hydropower coming to the South, it completely changed the course of human history here,
Yes.
and
Electricity,
culture.
yes.
Yeah, electricity. And I often think about how amazing it must have been to be alive then, and for the first time in your life, flip a light switch and see a bulb turn on, like that must have been akin to magic.
It
even
changed
if
the world.
If you knew how it worked, even, it must have felt magical. And
Right.
so I grew up hearing history and stories and legends and about the TVA and about these lakes and dams, and it fascinates me to no end. It really
in
does.
the novel, part of the beehive of activity is there are graves. They're old graves. Hernando de Soto may be graves. Then there are Indian graves. Then there are a regular graveyard. Then there are murdered people who have been chucked, and then they have to be moved. And so there's a whole lot of scurrying around, moving corpses in the course of the novel, which is, I think it's hysterical. I really like it because it's endless. I mean, it's Hugh who does most of the work, right? Poor man is scrambling around every minute.
He is hauling corpses back and forth from what will be flooded to his land.
In 1 minute, tell me, football, small town, Friday night football. It's in this book. It has to be, right? It was terribly important in your life, in your childhood, in your town.
I think terribly is the perfect adverb to describe it in some ways. Yeah, it was, and it still is to me. And last night I was in my hometown, and it was the homecoming parade for homecoming weekend, and so I went and stood and watched that go by. But yeah, I mean, I played football in high school, and it again just goes back to there's something about when a small place, there's not that many people, but when they come together over some tradition or obsession, and that electricity you feel in the air
Yeah.
when those people gather, and oftentimes that's a football game, that's a football field on a Friday night.
Sure,
And there's just something
sure.
about it that
Yeah.
utterly seduces me and makes me feel alive.
Well, they have football and they have Hernando de Soto, and they have beaches.
Yeah.
I mean, there's unifying effects in Alberta. At the end of every interview, I give a writer an opportunity to talk about the next project, the next book, the thing you're working on. In 60 seconds, tell me, if you will, what should we look for next?
Well, I'm working on another novel in addition to kind of always picking at some nonfiction pieces here and there. In this novel, I used to not be very superstitious about this, Don, but I kind of am now about saying too much. But I will say that, as I think a lot of us are, I wish more, or maybe I wish more people in certain places. As a lot of us are, I'm thinking a lot about the climate and the environment and
yes.
the repercussions of that, and what my future will look like, and what the future of other generations in my family will look like. So that's what I'm thinking about while I write this novel.
I think it's a perfectly sensible thing to be thinking about, frightening as it is. Caleb, thank you so much. I know you're passing through town. I'm so grateful you could sit and talk for a minute.
I'm so glad to. Thanks for having me, Don.